Hey class, welcome to week 4. Just to recap real quick, last week we talked about Pennsylvania, particularly, and how through the crucible of the 7 Years' War, the North American colonies started to gain a sense of purpose as constituent members of the British Empire, right? A premier dominant world power that had just defeated France in a kind of cataclysmic, nearly world war, right? So this week we're going to talk about how did they go from a moment of seeming unity and victory, flying high, to coming to basically a repetition of the 7 Years' War, where the colonies now, rather than fighting on behalf of the crown in London, turns against them, seeking their own independence and soliciting the help of France to fight its former, basically parent. Right. We're going to look at the track from Tom Paine this week that kind of goes into some of this, but more on that later. First, I want to cover basically what the British Empire was, right? I kind of mentioned in past lectures briefly here and there. I told you some history about how England becomes a premier power in the world. I mentioned briefly bits and pieces of what's going on back in London, but now this episode, I want to be a lot more clear and specific about this. So first of all, Great Britain has a limited monarchy. Now, most countries in Europe have a monarchy. The only major exception is the Netherlands, and even they have a kind of kingly figure. In Great Britain, however, since the Glorious Revolution, which, if you forget what that is, that's in your textbook, happens in 1688, part of the consequences of the Glorious Revolution, and it actually stretches back a couple of decades to the 1660 with the Restoration, was that the king could no longer operate his power in a way that was just autonomous, right? He had to be responsible to Parliament. So Parliament, right, and I'll get to that in just a second what that is. Parliament controlled the funds, right? So if the king wanted money to wage a war, he had to ask Parliament. Parliament had control of the army. So even though it's a royal navy, Parliament controlled the army. And there's reasons that we won't get into about that. But point being is that Great Britain and British people in general took great pride in the fact that its monarch had, rather than create conditions of slavery where the monarch is just the absolute despot, he controls everything, he's the master. No, in Great Britain, the monarch respects the law, he upholds the law, and he listens to the will of the people, right? And that's what Parliament was supposed to represent. So if you're an American, you might not be familiar with the term Parliament. Parliament is a very common form of government across the world. I think last time I checked, roughly 40% of the countries in the world have a parliamentary democracy. So basically, Parliament is similar to Congress, right? It's bicameral, meaning it has that's the two houses, two different components. So in the American example, which we'll talk more about when the United States forms up as a country, you got the House of Representatives, which is the lower house, and you have the Senate. Now I'll explain more of how that actually works. It doesn't work the way that it does now. It's a little bit different back then. But in Great Britain, you had two houses. You had the House of Lords, which is the top house, and you had the House of Commons. The House of Commons, people voted for, right? It's like Congress. About 20% of the population could vote at this time. You had to have enough property to be able to vote. There was some kind of funny corruption about some places. It was like tens, 20s, 30s, 40,000 people that filled one parliamentary seat. Where they're called members of parliament. In some places it was like 300, right? And these are known as rotten boroughs. But we're not going to get into all that. Point being, House of Commons, it was elected. It was a very powerful branch of government, and it tended to represent, right as it's in the name, the commons, the regular people. Now, of course, it meant usually wealthier people were the ones who voted, and even wealthier people, generally what are called gentlemen, or people who have the title Sir. So like Sir John Smith, that's a gentleman. Usually they're the ones who staffed the actual positions. They're the ones who got elected as members of parliament. Not always, but many times. And then on top of that, right, that exercised a great deal of power was known as the House of Lords, right? Unlike the American Senate, The House of Lords is not elected. The House of Lords was appointed by the king. The king would, you know, would appoint so many peers, which were basically the aristocracy, the nobility. People who sat in the House of Lords would be great landowners like Lord so and so, Duke so and so, Marquess so and so, and then also bishops in the Church of England would also sit in the House of Lords. Now, the House of Commons was the one that would create and propose legislation, but the House of Lords could shoot it down. And in Britain's kind of rigid class system, people in the House of Commons were usually in deep connection with people in the House of Lords, and people in the House of Commons would have patrons among the aristocracy so they could get better access to the king. But uh, generally, if you were very clever and winsome and you could actually negotiate and you had some money, it didn't matter if you were a commoner, you could rise pretty far. So there are some cases where commoners will get, will be made gentlemen at some point. They're knighted as sir, whatever, and then sometimes they would even get appointed a lordship. They would become lord so and so of whatever. But that's basically how the government worked. And Parliament held the king accountable. The king could not act without Parliament. Right? And Parliament generally was split between two major political parties. Now, again, they're not exactly like parties in the way that we think of Democrats versus Republicans, but the British model, which the Americans generally adopt when they get independence, follows this kind of two-party setup, right? There are the Whigs and there are the Tories. The Whigs tended to advocate for greater parliamentary power, greater power for the aristocracy, and the Tories tended to be, if you want to, it doesn't really work at all, But if you want to think about it, like, Whigs were a little bit more liberal, Tories were a little bit more conservative. But it doesn't really, that paradigm doesn't actually work. But if that's how you think about things, maybe that'll help you. Unlike the Whigs, who advocated for the rights of generally the aristocracy and people who were outside of the Church of England, tended to be Whigs. Tories were much more about crown and church, right? They supported the rights of the monarch, usually at the expense of the House of Lords, and they supported the rights of the church, usually at the expense of dissenters, right? People who are not part of the Church of England. There's roughly about 10% of the population, which involve different Christian denominations like the Baptists, the Presbyterians, Quakers, some things we've mentioned so far, some things we haven't. But Whigs tended to not support the rights of the church, and Tories tended to support them. So usually it had to do, the differences between Tories and Whigs tended to have to do with policies in relationship to the power of the monarch, the rights of the church, and then usually also how much to emphasize trade. I mean, well, I won't get into all the differences, but the point being, there were two different political parties. Now, during the early part of the 18th century, without getting into all the history, in 1714, George I succeeds as King of Great Britain. Now, what's unique about this is that due to the circumstances of British history, which I won't get into, George I was a sort of distant cousin from the preceding monarch, whose name was Queen Anne. But George I didn't speak any English. In fact, he was from a place called Hanover, which is in modern-day Germany. So when he came to Great Britain as monarch of Great Britain, he didn't speak English. He spoke German. I don't think he ever really learned English. And nevertheless, he was king of Great Britain. Now, why did this come about? 1714, the issue was making sure that Great Britain had a Protestant monarch and not a Catholic one. And the rest of Anne's family, which was part of the reason why 1688 happens. If you want to know more, you can look it up, use your search bar on the internet, or there's some stuff in the textbook about it. It was, basically trying to cut out this old royal family that had predominantly been Catholics. Now, George I was basically functioned as a party monarch, right? He sided with the Whigs because George I had no idea what was going on. So he allowed the Whigs basically to run the show. There's a long history where the Whigs developed basically the first concept of a prime ministership, but we won't get into all that. Suffice to say that this guy named Robert Walpole was super influential in basically running the government and shutting the Tories out of political power. Um, but after George I, he's succeeded by George II, obviously, and then George II is then succeeded by George III. Now, George III was different than either George I and George II in this way. George III was born in Great Britain. His first language was English. And so when George III took the throne, he filled what one political operator and theorist had been hoping for, is the idea of a patriot king. He was young, he was attractive, he was charming, he was sincere. He seemed to be genuinely interested in the success of Great Britain as the world premier Protestant power. Right? George I, kind of corrupt, didn't speak English. George II, also corrupt. He actually was the last king of Great Britain to take the field, but he took the field at the head of an army to defend his territory in Europe in Hanover. George III was solidly committed to Great Britain, and so with him coming to the throne, he broke the Whig stranglehold on political power, and the Tories returned as a viable political party. Right? So there was great hope, right? George III, right? Lots of colonists were very excited about him. They bought all sorts of cheap goods, which we'll talk about. But he was somebody that could unite all Britons across the world to be proud of their empire. The final thing, which is going to be a lot more important later, so write this down, make sure to note this. Another key thing about Britain is the Bank of England. Why is the Bank of England important, right? Well, the Bank of England, really short, I could go on and on and on about this. I'm trying to take care of your time, but the Bank of England was a semi-public, semi-private financial institution that loaned to the government. So normally, if the king wanted to get money, right, he ran out of money, he doesn't have any gold coins in his treasure chest, to put it really crudely, he would have to go around asking people to borrow money, right? You need money to pay soldiers, you need money to buy equipment, you need money to feed them, you need money to basically keep an army functioning. So you had to go around begging people for money. Of course, when people loan money, especially to kings, because kings are powerful, maybe they choose not to pay you back, whatever. You're going to loan money, but you're going to loan it on interest, and the more risky the loan, the higher the interest rate, right? I'll get into more of this stuff later, but England pioneers, learning from the Dutch, this new kind of financial institution that is designed explicitly to loan to the government. And since the government is controlled basically by the same people who run the bank, which was predominantly these aristocratic Whigs in the House of Lords and out of the House of Lords who are running the bank, or elected to the House of Commons, or kind of political operators supporting from the outside, the Bank of England was able to loan to the government. The government was always responsible to pay back the loans, which allowed the interest rates to drop, which allowed the government to borrow more money. So on the plus side, right, Great Britain could loan 4 times as much as France could, right? France didn't have any of this. It's a long story that I won't get into, but they never designed anything like this until much, much later. But even though France was wealthier, even though France had more people, even though France was more powerful in Europe, Great Britain was able to contend and compete because of the bank. So when Britain and France went to war, Britain could loan and loan and loan more and more money, right? Could keep fighting the war, could keep getting money, because the people who are investing, the people who are donating, putting their money in the Bank of England for the purposes of loaning it to the crown, know that they're going to get their money back. They know that their investment is going to be good. And the better the investment, you can lower the rates because you know you're going to get your money. And the more and more money you put in there, the more and more you're going to get back on your investment. This is the idea of a national debt. So the government would just keep going and going and going into debt and could keep raising money to do whatever it wanted. On the plus side, this meant, being able to do infrastructure, right? On the negative side, this means, right, you need money to run war efforts. So if you want to build an empire, you need this kind of financial institution. So if you're against empire, you're against basically armies running around the world conquering places, this bank was a bad idea. And some of the Tories, some of them were just kind of jaded. They got cut out. some of whom had principal reasons concerned about the expansion of the empire. Britain was kind of overextending itself, taking over places, so on and so forth. This was not really a good thing. But it made Parliament incredibly powerful because it meant the king could keep borrowing money to do what he wanted, and Parliament could do what it wanted. So everyone it seemed to be a win-win, right? As long as the debts kept being serviced, as long as they could pay the minimum balance on their credit card, basically. Bank of England becomes super important because in the United States, similar ideas get brought up. In fact, the Federal Reserve is basically operating from the model of the Bank of England. A little bit different, a little bit more government oversight, but it's still a private institution that loans money, and it's for the purposes, functionally, of enriching the stockholders of the bank and the investors. So the people aren't loaning money because, oh, we love our country so much, we want to help the people. No, 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 no. They're getting rich from this, right? They're making money from their money, and they're just rolling in it. Nevertheless, this is what makes Great Britain incredibly powerful and allows Britain to keep fighting France even though Britain is smaller, poorer, and weaker. So here's just a quick picture. Right? Isn't he handsome? George III, looking dashing in his robes and such. This is the kind of image that colonists would see, and they would think, "Oh man, it's really great to be British. Look how great our king is." Now, we already covered a lot of this stuff when we were talking about slavery, but obviously, key thing, right, was one of the week 2 IDs. Sugar is incredibly important to the British Empire. Right, first starts with Barbados, then moves to Jamaica. Right, Jamaica right there is much larger than Barbados. Right, you can't even really see Barbados on this map, but Jamaica is a big block. Won't get into all that, but this was really important for the British, and it was pretty much important for all European powers, right? So here is Cuba, right? That was the Spanish sugar depot, right? That's where they got all their money, and Cuba's still really big for sugar today. And then the other one, right, what I just circled is Saint-Domingue, or modern-day Haiti, and the French grew their sugar there, right? Again, connected to global slave trade. Sugar is really hard to make. Nobody really wants to do it, especially when you want them to do backbreaking labor and pay them nothing, right? So importing Africans was the way the world worked, right? That's why there are people of African heritage in Cuba. That's why Haiti is almost completely made up of a black population, and similarly with Jamaica, right? These are all the descendants of slaves who were settled there to work in the sugar fields and processing sugar. Now, Saint-Domingue, right, as you can see, it's right next to Jamaica, which is right here again. Right next to each other, Britain and France were in tension, right? They're making sugar, they're trying to sell sugar, they're trying to make a lot of money, both within their empire and then exporting it to other countries in Europe and abroad, right? So this was part of the rivalry between Britain and France, and it was also the reason why, even though Britain, much stronger as a naval power, took Saint-Domingue, it had to return it because, look, we know the French are going to come back for this. They need this, right? The whole population there speaks French. And the British had no intention at this point of freeing the slaves. So they gave it back to them in exchange for Canada, which will cause problems, as we'll see. Additionally, right, as Jamaica was exceptionally wealthy, I mean, people showed up there, boom, millionaires overnight, right? This made a lot of money in the sugar game. Because they could afford that, Jamaica had a very powerful lobby in London influencing affairs in Parliament. So, right, maybe someone comes to the floor in Parliament and says, we should pass a bill that taxes Jamaica more, right? Or maybe we should tax sugar, or maybe we do some kind of policy that affects the sugar power. So then the people in London, connected to Jamaica, would kind of pressure certain members of Parliament, saying, oh no, you got to kill that bill, you got to fight it, you got to resist it. So part of the reason that we're going to see, right, the North American colonies get squeezed by the aftershocks of the 7 Years' War, but Jamaica doesn't. Why? Because Jamaica had strength. Jamaica could basically push people around in London and make Parliament decide favorably on them. So when the North American colonies say, hey, you're not treating us right, London said, sorry, that's too bad. But when they pissed off Jamaica, Jamaica could pull strings and boom, right, all the problems go away. So when the 7 Years' War aftershocks hit, Jamaica gets everything it wants. It has no reason to rebel. It benefits completely from being within the British Empire. So we're not going to really return to the Caribbean islands too much, but just so you know, um, Jamaica, Barbados, all of these islands, they don't really want to join the American Revolution, right? They're perfectly happy being part of the British Empire because they got clout. All right, so real briefly, I'm going to go over the economics of British America, right? How did trade, society, marketing, all this stuff function? How do people make money? So obviously, one thing, right? Being British, being connected to this world empire, a lot of people in the colonies imported goods. Obviously, one thing they imported, which will be important, is tea. That came from China and India, and we're going to get into more of that later. They got sugar from the islands. They got manufactured clothes, so like shirts, pants, socks, things that if unless you made them yourself, you had to buy them from somewhere. And the place that people bought them from was being imported from Great Britain. So that's where they got that. And of course, slaves. Slaves were coming from either the Caribbean by indirect route or they came straight from the coast of Africa. And so the big merchant cities, right, you're going to want to remember this. It's very helpful for basically understanding American politics. The big merchant cities were heavily invested in British consumption, right? They wanted to import these goods. Why? Because their ships would be loaded up. They'd dump it off on the cities, and then the cities would then sell it to people either living in the city or people on the outskirts in various towns, right? Super lucrative. They made a lot of money. They were very happy to be a part of the British Empire, but when the British Empire starts squeezing them, then that's where things start getting dicey. Of course, what are these major mercantile cities? It's Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston, South Carolina. And those four places, Massachusetts, Virginia, or sorry, Massachusetts, South Carolina, New York, and Pennsylvania are going to be the places with the most disastrous kind of development of the American Revolution, where the elites there really don't want to leave, except for Massachusetts, which we'll get to. They really benefit from being part of the British Empire, and then after the American Revolution, it's those cities that have people that want to kind of reconnect with the British Empire as much as possible, right? Why? Because the business is good. Now, again, like I mentioned, British British trade within the empire was very important to colonies, but right, merchants are greedy sometimes, right? You can trade, but maybe you want to trade more. You want to make more money. You want to invest in a greater kind of situation and become even more powerful. Well, one of the issues that was limiting British power here was this concept, right? It's not a great term. It's got a lot of complicated parts to it, but this idea of mercantilism. And the idea, which was passed in a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, you can look it up in your textbook if you want to know more about it. But I kind of mentioned it briefly in week 2. But the Navigation Acts basically established a policy where colonists, everyone within the British Empire, should only trade within the empire. And sometimes that meant the king would appoint a certain group of people, a certain corporation, and give them a charter to basically be the only ones in town that are allowed to sell this or that good. So this is what's called a monopoly. This was government sanctioned, and the idea was that it could regulate the flow of goods to kind of make sure there was never too much, never too little, and it could engage in a level of price control. Of course, the downside of this meant, this company was the only one who was selling it. If the company's kind of corrupt, it could kind of fix the prices so that they get more money out of it, right? Squeeze people as long as the government kind of turns a blind eye to it. And then if you're a merchant and you want to kind of sell your own stuff, oh, that's too bad. You gotta go work for the company, right? So it kind of squeezed out the little guy. And so there were a lot of people in places like Boston, Philadelphia, right? Even though they're really happy about the British Empire, they would like to embrace, and this is particularly the case in Boston, they would like to embrace something more like free trade, which means, hey, if you got a boat, you got guys on your ship, you can basically go wherever you want, buy and sell goods, and bring it back and buy and sell whatever you want, right? Now, this is not what the British government did, and this irritated some people. They felt like they were being restrained by the kind of the hand of the government, kind of reining them in. But you know, again, this was sort of a complicated issue. There's no pure mercantilist system. There's no pure free trade system. It's usually some kind of mixture, which means these terms are only kind of useful to kind of show you the lay of the land. But just to say, right, not everyone was happy about the trade policies the government was enacting. Another main thing about British economics, or British colonial economics, was what's called land speculation. This is basically real estate hunting. Except in this case, right, you're not buying houses, you're buying plots of land. And so there were companies like George Washington's participation in the Ohio Company. They would go out, look at big tracts of land, try to acquire it, and then flip it to, selling it to people at a higher rate than they had purchased it, and then you just get the cash to check, right? You're not responsible for what happens there. You're not really, you might not even really own the land, right? Maybe you scam some Indians out of it. Doesn't matter, right? It's a big business, and then people who want to make money on top of their money, they'll invest in these big land speculating companies that send out people like George Washington to go out and survey land to see if it's worth anything, how much they think they can sell it, if they can buy it. They come up with propaganda tracks. Oh my goodness, this place is so beautiful. The crops just jump out of the ground, right? You don't even have to work. And of course, somebody's like, oh man, I want to own a house. I want to go farm myself. And then boom, they show up. What happens? Right? The land sucks. Or there's Indians that are saying, hey, get the hell out of here. This is my house. This kind of stuff. Occasionally, this would go really, really badly. We're going to get to some of these boom-bust economic cycles due to land speculation. But for the purposes here, land speculation works indefinitely. The potential for profits could grow infinitely as long as you got new land, as long as you got something to sell. But in 1763, right, we talked about King George III issues the proclamation line. He says, no more people are allowed to cross the Appalachians. West of the Appalachians, that's Indian land. East of the Appalachians, that's British land. And everything else, right, it's all settled. Of course, there were plenty of colonists saying, hey man, I didn't get my property. I don't have a house. I was going to move over there. I was going to move across the Appalachians. I was going to go to, basically Pittsburgh or Ohio or Kentucky or Tennessee or whatever. And this felt like they were getting blocked. And, at an individual level, it's like, the whole point of coming to America was then just cut off by the government. But then additionally, these land speculation companies, their fortunes seem to be drying up, right? Who's going to invest in people if there's no more land to buy and acquire, right? If the government just said, look, we're going to have this new peaceful arrangement, this is how it's going to go, right? This is bad for business. Additionally, well, I'm not going to get into this too much because I'll kind of return to the basic conceptual issues in another lecture. But colonial monetary policies, each colony's assembly had control of its own finances. And for some colonies, they could even print their own money, which meant you weren't reliant on what London was doing. You didn't have to rely on the Bank of England. You didn't have to worry about what the British Parliament was doing in terms of their own monetary policy. These colonies could kind of do this for themselves. So they were able to kind of, and what did this actually mean? It meant the assembly could say, okay, we're going to create X amount of money, right? We're going to spend it to develop this or that or whatever. So this allowed the colonies basically to develop themselves, protect themselves, and kind of go whichever way they wanted to. Now, all right, all these things, right? That's how British economics work, and the reason why I wanted to kind of hash that out is because, and this is my argument, right? There are people who might make different arguments, but I think this is the most compelling. A major component to the American Revolution cannot, you can't understand the American Revolution. A major component with is economics, right? The selling and buying of goods, monetary policy, trade. You can't understand why people are getting so agitated. And almost all the famous events in the American Revolution and why certain places revolted and other places hesitated is due to trade, money policy, finance, um, all that good stuff. So, what were some of these things that kind of spiked this up, right? Why did the colonies were so happy to have crushed the French, right? Remember, being British is good. You want to be British, right? You're free. You got rights. Um, you know, lots of other good stuff. Why did they start to turn against the government? Why did Americans start to associate, right? No, we're not British anymore. British is bad. Well, it has to do with this. The 7 Years' War ends. Great Britain victorious, seems to be doing well, but it's actually precisely the opposite. Britain had just won this great war. It just inherited all this territory, but it had spent an incredible amount of money, right? It had to borrow all of this money from the Bank of England and from some other financial services, and now it needed to pay it back. Of course, people in London, people in Parliament are starting to think, okay, well, when's the next war? And when the next war is coming, right, we're stretched too thin. We don't have enough resources to fight. Our army's weak and kind of run down. Our navy had just gotten bruised fighting the French. We won, but hey, what if France wants to go again? Or what if the Netherlands turns on us, or Spain, or whatever? Um, what if we have another Indian war? So people in Parliament were really worried about what the future was going to be like. So rightfully, maybe, some people in Parliament said, hey, you know what? We used our army, we used our funds, we defended the colonists. So, look, that's fine, that's our job, but they got to pony up. They need to pay their due to say, thank you, Great Britain, thank you for protecting us. Right? We're going to have to increase your tax, we're going to need to pay more in taxes. So, Parliament says, look, they got to pay their fair share. And so, when they start passing this succession of tax bills, some of which are just basically closing loopholes, colonists, particularly in these merchant cities, get livid. Right? So the first one is the Sugar Act. Now this might seem kind of silly, right? Again, you got to pay more money on your sugar. But remember, sugar is big business. And in particular, the Sugar Act was adding a tax on French molasses. Now, people in the colonies are not even really supposed to be doing business with France. But everybody knows that Boston merchants, Philadelphia merchants, etc., are buying sugar from France, particularly in the form of molasses, which is just liquid sugar. Now, of course, with molasses, you can do lots of stuff. You can put it in food and make it sweet. You can, make desserts and cookies and all sorts of other things. But the other big thing, which was a big part of American kind of diplomacy with Indians, was turning it into rum. If you let molasses ferment, that's how you make rum. And American traders would sweeten the deal with Native Americans. It actually became basically a ritual form of land purchasing, right? You share drinks, right? We still do that, right? It still makes sense. Maybe not you guys, because you might be too young for that, but I don't know. I don't know how old anyone is. Um, but it was just a lot of people drank. So by increasing the price of molasses, by adding another tax on it, everyone who used molasses means everyone who drank rum now had to pay more money, right? So this really irritated people, particularly the merchants who were buying it, because now their goods aren't going to sell as well, and they're going to make less money because the government's taking, a big chunk of their check. So, it pissed some people off. Additionally, the government passed the Revenue Act, which was just a series of tariffs. Tariffs meant, if basically it's a tax on imported goods. So what this penalized basically was the colonies were importing stuff from Great Britain, and most people were kind of happy about that, but it was kind of double damning because not only did now the government require them to pay more money, right? So if you want to import stuff, you're gonna have to pay a tax on it, but then the government in London prohibited the colonies from manufacturing their own stuff. And the reason was, right, if you're a factory owner in Great Britain, you don't really want to compete with people in the colonies, right? Maybe they'll do better than you, right? You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose your business. You don't want to lose your company because you're competing with people across the ocean. So these kinds of people lobbied the government, the parliament in London, said, look, can you just restrict them, right? We'll do the exporting, and we'll do the exporting of finished goods, right? So like textiles, hats, pants, shoes, shirts, socks, all that. And the colonies, well, textiles doesn't apply to shoes, but they also produce shoes and send it to the colonies. And then the colonies would send their raw goods, right? Fur, crops, metal, all that stuff. So this relationship kind of only works if both sides are benefiting, but um, this will come up later in other lectures. If you can't manufacture for yourself, you're really dependent on the people who manufacture for you. So this, by some leaders in the colonies, this felt like Great Britain basically doing a power grab. And so on top of that, right now you're gonna tax us on top of it, right? This seems outrageous. Additionally, Great Britain gets upset with how the colonies are sort of printing their own money, financing themselves, so they pass the Currency Act and ban the colonies from making their own money, which now subjects the colonial governments to official monetary policy being set by the Bank of England and being pushed by the Parliament. And then finally, and this one is the most damning, right? And you can find a section from Benjamin Franklin being interviewed by Parliament and telling Parliament about how this act was received. The Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act, unlike the other ones, which really only impacted merchants and people who needed credit, the Stamp Act impacted everyone because for anyone to basically use paper, which was everybody, any kind of contract that you sign, any business deal, anytime you go to the store and buy anything, you're using paper. And so all these papers required a stamp, and the stamp had to be bought from the government, and this was basically a direct tax on everyone. So now people throughout the colonies, right, not just merchants, but a lot of people were getting pissed. Now, as this picture kind of shows, there was widespread opposition, but this opposition wasn't, let's break away from Great Britain, to hell with them, right? No, it was advocating Parliament, you're doing us wrong, you're treating us poorly, right? George III, can you help us? And in fact, it basically worked. Most of these acts are repealed. The Stamp Act is eventually repealed, but it just kind of damages this relationship where it seems like Parliament is the one who's victimizing the poor colonies, right? Taking all of their money, subduing them, leaving them like slaves, right? This is kind of ominous, right? Why are you treating us like the French would treat their people, right? I thought we're British, right? So that starts to break down the relationship. Now, those are some of the general friction, the kind of fraying of the bonds between Great Britain and the colonies. But even within the colonies, people start to divide, ultimately into what the Revolutionary War will split into loyalists. So people also they were called Tories. So people who remain loyal to Great Britain, and then the patriots, right? People pursuing independence because they think it's the best way forward for the colonies. All right. So how did the American colonists begin to split? So first, real briefly, in South and North Carolina, they're both somewhat different, but they were both called the Regulator Movement. The Regulators were small farmers in the case of North Carolina, and in South Carolina, they were elite farmers, but they were kind of locked out of the rice plantation world of South Carolina. They felt like they were being victimized by the wealthier people further east. The governments of these, right, in basically response to from pressure from Great Britain's Parliament, they increased taxes. People out west, they thought these taxes were unjust. They thought they were made up. They thought they were ridiculous. So when the tax collector comes, they just beat them up and send them home, right? They're not going to take it. They're not going to put up with it. So what ends up happening, the colonial governments of North and South Carolina ask Great Britain to basically send them soldiers so they can put down these instigators, these troublemakers, and they're mostly successful in doing this. However, one, this makes the kind of Western farmers, these small little farmers, they makes them much more jaded about Great Britain, right? Why is Parliament doing this to us? And then it also creates dependence from these elites in North and South Carolina upon the government of Great Britain, right? If we would lose our power if Parliament didn't send us soldiers. So this starts to create a divide between the regular people and the elites. Additionally, um, there are divisions happening in New York, right? As I said, New York City is a big trade hub. But outside of New York City, it's actually very weird compared to the rest of the colonies. New York was predominantly owned by a few tiny families, right? I mean, look at New York. It's massive, right? And it was owned by just a couple people, which meant everybody who was living in upstate New York were tenants. They were renters. Now, this created a sense of animosity because, unlike New York, every other colony basically opened its land so that people could buy it and they'd own the land, they'd own the property on it, and they were their own masters, basically. But in New York, pretty much all the people who lived there had to serve their landlords. And this won't go away. We're going to come to this, weeks and weeks from now. This issue continues into the 19th century, into the 1840s. But New York didn't even have an assembly. The landlords basically function as a kind of feudal arrangement where the tenants are supposed to pay their respects. But this felt demeaning and diminishing, and right, we're Britons. We're not supposed to do this. This is kind of backward, savage behavior. So this created some tensions where the tenants seek redress. They're trying to get help. The landlords depend upon Parliament to basically get the soldiers to make sure that tenants couldn't rise up against landlords throughout the country or throughout the state. And of course, Albany is a very important place, which will eventually be New York's capital. But it's this trade depot, but it's this center of a hub of all these sort of landlord networks, right? New York City might be the heart, but the sort of nervous system is Albany. So this splits elites from commoners in New York. Another major thing that kind of divides people is the Quartering Act. Right? You might remember this from elementary school, but the Quartering Act basically said, look, all right, we need to kind of put down all these rebellions. Right? 1763 was when the 7 Years' War ended. 1763 was also the year the Pontiac's War began, and it didn't end until 1766. So the Quartering Act says, look, we got rebellions in Carolinas. We got potential instability in New York. We got all sorts of stuff. There's Indians uprising, right? So we got to put soldiers on the ground. We got to have boots on the ground. But where are they going to stay? So Parliament passes this law that says, look, if you got open space in your home, soldiers are legally, they have the legal right to stay there, right? They can demand to stay in your home. So, this created some discomfort, right? You're in your home with your wife and your kids, and a soldier just shows up and says, look, lady, I live here now, right? Too bad. Some people maybe got along with this, but again, this is a little nervy. Not only are you putting an armed man in your house around your children, if you have little kids, your daughter, your wife, you don't know this man, he's a stranger. But on top of it, this kind of raised the specter of a fear, the idea of a standing army. And basically, right, and this isn't even thinkable today, people don't even ponder this, but in previous eras, right, you don't have a standing army. You don't just pay soldiers to sit around to be ready to go to war at any moment. Maybe you have militias, you train people who are not professional soldiers, meaning the government doesn't pay them, right? They're just training because they want to protect their town, they want to protect their home. It's a very local affair. But when you have a professional army, you could use that army to crush rebellion, right? So maybe things aren't going so good in Philadelphia, so then the soldiers just crack down, crush the people when they're demonstrating, right? So this was a fear that seemed very rational and went back a long ways in English history, so people were upset about that. Additionally, this is a little bit more complex, but just to simplify it, the Parliament under the basically the Treasury guy at the time, Townsend, passed a new law that increased taxes on the colonies, but then used the money from the taxes to pay the royal governors and the royal councils throughout the colonies. So basically, what it ended up doing was most people had to now pay more money, but this money was going into the pockets of some of the wealthiest, most powerful people within the colonies, which basically cemented the loyalty of these governors and their allies within each of these colonies, which created divisions between the common people who had to pay the taxes and the royal governors and their councils and their family and their friends who were benefiting from these. Eventually, the Townshend Act is repealed. It was super unpopular, but it just showed, people are starting to become very suspicious and wary about what the government is capable of doing. Finally, and this is the most damning and the one that's the most celebrated in American history, is the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act, the way this worked was the government in Britain, they created a monopoly corporation known as the East India Company, and it's very notorious. It pops up in all sorts of movies and stuff. So it's in the Pirates of the Caribbean. If you ever watched those movies, the East India Company basically became a government in India. It was super powerful. It was like it'd be like if it would be like if Google owned California, like straight out. The government of California was owned by Google, or Apple owned Ireland, which in both of those cases is actually more true than not. But you just straight out had a company running the country, running affairs, paying an army, doing all this stuff. But anyway, East India Company, one of the things they were responsible for as an importer and exporter from India was the shipment and sale of tea. So the Tea Act prohibited the colonists from buying tea from anyone else, which meant no more smuggling from the French or the Dutch. They had to exclusively buy it from the East India Company. They couldn't just sail there and buy it themselves and sell it to themselves, right, as a people. Now, people, in Great Britain, right, is a stereotype. Everybody drinks tea. Tea is still very popular in Great Britain. And the colonies had adopted this habit, right? They started to become a nation of tea drinkers. So basically saying, look, everybody drinks this. It was basically like water. People drink tea like water. It's what civilized people would do. You drink tea, even if you didn't like it. That's what you're supposed to do. So everybody drank tea, and now you're saying I have to buy it from this company, and so they could set whatever rates they wanted, right? This is a monopoly. They're the only ones who are in control. So some people who were tired of being kind of bossed around by the government in Great Britain, right? They took action, right? And so this is what's known as the Boston Tea Party, where a group of powerful, wealthy merchants, these were not just like regular street people, these were pretty influential people in Boston. They dressed up like Indians, or they paid people to dress up like Indians. And they got on this ship that was an East India Company ship that had all this tea, and they took all the tea and they threw it in the bay, right? Now, this sounds kind of dumb and sort of juvenile, right? Who cares, right? It's just like, okay, now like the Boston Harbor tastes like Tetley's, tea, whatever. Okay. But this was a huge form of economic warfare. This would be like, hey, you don't like the policies that Apple's setting for their new iPhone, and like a group of people, like, I don't know, Washington insiders, basically like senators and the sons of senators, went to an Apple factory and just blew it up. Right? This was the equivalent. Millions of dollars just destroyed instantly. So, for the government in Britain, many of whom had relatives or were themselves once members of the East India Company, right? This is getting out of control. The people of Boston are acting crazy, and they're rebelling against illegal parliamentary laws that are being passed. These colonies really should not be acting this way, right? That's the idea. That's how they're receiving this. They should not be acting this way. We protect them. We preserve them. We establish the roots of trade. And now they're just, this group of insurrectionists, these rebels, are causing all sorts of chaos and basically tearing society apart. So people in Parliament, mostly Tories, but even some Whigs, they've had it. So they're getting frustrated. The British government, the colonies are starting to have friction, especially for colonial elites in places like Virginia and in Massachusetts. We're not going to get into all the reasons why Virginian elites are starting to feel agitated and slighted by the way Great Britain is doing things. But you'll see that, right? The split where the Americans are starting to think of themselves as their own kind of country. Though, again, it's not until much later where Americans start to think of the United States or America as their country. They're thinking of their own colonies as their own little country. So if you're from Virginia, Virginia is your country. You're known as a Virginian. If you're from Massachusetts, you're a Massachusettsan or a New Englander. But you're not thinking in this sort of comprehensive national sense. But you're starting to feel agitated about how Britain is treating you, and they're ripping away your English liberties, right? Your freedoms, right? You're a British person, right? You're supposed to be civilized. You're Protestant. You're free, not like the French. In fact, the Parliament is starting to act like France. It's starting to issue out these dictatorial orders. Right? We didn't get to vote on these taxes. We didn't get to appoint anyone to represent us in sort of figuring out these affairs. We're just sort of following orders, right? Um, and then, they're trying to buy off our elites, right? And some of these elites are saying, yeah, these people are out of control, right? So there's starting to be divisions. And next lecture, we're going to talk about this in Pennsylvania, where unlike most of the colonies, all of the elites in Pennsylvania side with Great Britain, and it leaves Pennsylvania in an interesting position, but we'll get to that. But most importantly, starting to turn people was this threat to their freedoms, what they conceived of as their rights. So obviously, one major episode in all of this is in 1770. There's the Boston Massacre. So what is the Boston Massacre? Basically, what happened, right? We got these soldiers who were placed there by the Quartering Act. They're living in Boston. People in Boston don't really like the soldiers. They're agitated. They feel like they're threatened by an occupying army. Right? We're free New Englanders, and now you got soldiers stationed because you don't know what's going to happen. Right? Again, this is before the Tea Party happens. But this is what kind of sets the scale or sets the stage for the Tea Party even happening in the first place. This feeling that the British government is turning against its own people. So anyway, the soldiers are stationed, and a group of dock workers, right? These are kind of like, regular dudes. They start getting into a fight with the soldiers. They start laughing at them, yelling at them, mocking them, and then they start throwing snowballs. Now, apparently, one of these snowballs had a rock in it, or it was made out of ice, or maybe there was even a club involved. But anyway, somebody throws this, they're throwing these snowballs, it hits one of the soldiers in the head, the soldier ends up shooting his gun, and then, right, this just sort of spirals into chaos. The British soldiers feel like they're under attack, they're being attacked by a crazy mob of people throwing things, yelling at them, screaming, and so the soldiers shoot. And they end up killing about somewhere like roughly around a dozen people, right? And one of the people killed, who's considered a sort of martyr for the American Revolution. This guy here in this painting is known as Crispus Attucks. He was a sailor, and he was Afro-Caribbean. So he was one of the first people to die, at least as memorialized by some people, first people to die for the cause of American freedom. But it just, even though this takes place, it's kind of resolved rather peaceably. Actually, John Adams, who will go on to be president of the United States and a huge leader within the cause of American independence, he actually takes the side of the British soldiers and proves that the soldiers did not shoot the crowd unprovoked, but felt like they were under attack. In fact, maybe they were under attack, and the court finds them not guilty. Of course, this irritates people throughout Boston who feel like the British can just literally murder people with impunity and walk away scot-free. So this only kind of created more agitation, and it created this sense that the British government, represented by its soldiers, really don't care about our lives. They'll literally kill us, right? So that didn't sit well. Another issue, which I won't get into, is a little bit complicated for the purposes of this class, but just real briefly, because this is something I find kind of interesting. There had been talk in Great Britain, right, about appointing a bishop for the American colonies. And when I say bishop, I mean a bishop of the Church of England. Now, like the Church of England, which has this episcopal form of government, which means ruled by bishops, the Roman Catholic Church also has bishops. Now, people in New England especially, but in some of the other parts of the colonies, when they heard that in the 1760s there was another attempt to appoint a bishop, they went nuts. They thought, oh, look, the government is trying to control us. They're trying to take away our particular form of Protestantism. Remember, that's Puritan Congregationalism. It's not really Puritan anymore, but nevertheless, they were hostile to this imposition upon them. And even though the bishop really wouldn't have had any real political power, they were paranoid that this is one step closer to tyranny, taking away our British freedom to be Protestant, right, and trying to impose the Church of England upon the colonies. Now, again, Church of England's Protestant, but there had been, it had been a propaganda battle to basically paint the Church of England as secretly Catholic, and thus, consequently, the people sending the bishop, whether it's Parliament or the king, painting them as secretly Roman Catholic. Which, again, remember the binary: if you're acting like a Roman Catholic, that means you're secretly French, which means you're secretly barbarian, and means you secretly want to enslave everyone. So ultimately, the government never really had made real plans to install a bishop, but it caused a lot of chaos. Another big thing, which relates directly to the Catholic thing, was the Quebec Act. Now, when Great Britain inherited Canada, they inherited a French-speaking population, Quebec, but not only a French-speaking population, but a Roman Catholic population. So Britain, right, again, right, the binary really works mostly at a propaganda level, not the actual policies the governments were taking, or maybe even what individuals thought themselves. But you could rile people up with this because of the fear and the chaos and the secrets being held. The British government passes the Quebec Act saying, look, you're not going to be threatened. You're not going to be forced to give up speaking French. You're not going to be forced to give up your church, right? Just pledge loyalty to the King of Great Britain, and we'll allow official toleration. So for people in Canada, this is great, right? They'll leave us alone. But for people in the colonies, particularly Massachusetts and the rest of New England, this was this great betrayal, right? We're the great Protestant power. We're defending the rights of all Protestants, and you're going to give tolerance to Catholics, openly Catholic Frenchmen, right? Especially, right, and look at the year, right, 1774. This is after the Tea Act and the Tea Party. This is after a decade of various taxes. This is after the Boston Massacre, and you're going to give political privileges and toleration to French Catholics? This only created paranoia. Oh, maybe the crown, maybe the parliament is against us. And then finally, and this is the big thing, right? Most people think, and this is how it's taught in a lot of elementary school textbooks. Most people think the colonists said, "We're tired of being treated like slaves by the king." Wrong. In fact, most colonists were angry about Parliament. They thought the Parliament in London, which they didn't get, right, they didn't get to sit in. They had no representation there. They couldn't vote on anything, which means even though they have to pay taxes, this is where that expression, no taxes, no representation. This is where that kind of comes in, where people in the colonies to say, look, Parliament doesn't represent us. Our assemblies represent us. Those are the places where we elect people. Those are the places where we pass laws for ourselves. Parliament can't come in here and tell us what to do. So actually, people in the colonies, up until the very end, even people sitting in the Continental Congress, which we'll get into more next week, up until the very end, they thought, look, if only the king knew what was happening. George III, Patriot King, he loves the Britons, right? He loves British freedom. He loves British civilization. He loves our Protestant empire. If only he knew what was going on, he would save us. He would stop this corrupt parliament. He would give our assemblies rights. He would protect us as free British people with British rights. Of course, what will end up happening in 1775 and 1776, George III will come out very strong, saying anyone who resists my military, anyone who resists acts of parliament is a traitor and will be hung as a traitor, right? Now this is what really sets people on edge, right? There are people in the colonies, particularly people like Thomas Jefferson, who are already beginning to question the monarchy, right? Monarchies are corrupt. Monarchies create tyranny. Monarchies create slavery. We should abolish the monarchy and create a representative republic, right? But most people in America are not quite willing to give up on the monarchy, right? Great Britain's monarch was limited. He didn't have absolute powers. He established the role of Parliament. He helped kind of back up their laws. So they had great hope and confidence that if only George III knew, he would help us. Then when it turns out, hey, even George III, right? More so than even Parliament, because there were people in Parliament who were saying, look, we need to respect the rights of the colonies. These taxes are bad, right? But George III, even more than Parliament, had turned against the colonies. This is what really sparked division, right? And so all of this is kind of building up and coalescing. 1775, all of the 13 colonies of North America, right? So that's, right, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Rhode Island, and all the rest, right? They're all getting together and they're sitting down and they're saying they call themselves the Continental Congress, and they say, look, things are getting bad. We need to sort of send a letter to George III and get this straightened out. We need to talk with the Parliament. We can negotiate. We can debate. And in the next lecture, we're going to see that not only does that absolutely fail, right? In 1775, you get the first shot. Someone called it the shot heard around the world. The first firing of the British Army against colonial militia in Massachusetts, the battles of Lexington and Concord, which is in your textbook, which is how the chapter ends. But you have people decidedly within the Continental Congress beginning to say, we cannot repair this relationship. The ties between Great Britain and us 13 colonies are severed, and we need to move our own way. But again, this is a very complex process. It builds up over time. And for most people in the American colonies, I would argue, did not want independence, and they only went into it hesitatingly. And then when it came, right, it came with a crash, right? People embraced it full throttle, and the American Revolution was underway. But at every point, it seemed like this was not inevitable. Maybe we can patch things up. Maybe Britain and America can kind of hold together, but it was not to be. So next week, we're going to deal with that. And until then, I'm your host, John Parks. Until then, hang in there and stay in peace. Bye.